The Hilton sale is on. Now through September 29th, you can save up to 20% on stays this fall and beyond. Long weekends, last-minute getaways, holiday gatherings. There's a Hilton stay for all of them. More moments, more experiences, more destinations. Now 20% off for a limited time because it matters where you stay. Don't wait. Book by September 29th and save up to 20% at Hilton.com. Terms apply. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. On this members-only episode, we'll be hearing about Alexios Komnenos' first big break and his bid to rise the ranks of Byzantine greatness. This one deals with a Norman who nearly created his own Norman state way out in eastern Anatolia. We're continuing the miniseries called The Book of Alexios, and this is Patreon episode 20, and it's entitled Chapter 1, Roussel de Balliol. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. I said this on the last episode, but it bears repeating. Anna Komnene writes in her biography of her father, entitled The Alexiad, quote, "In the reign of Michael Ducas, after the downfall of the Emperor Diogenes, the Roussel episode proved how valiant he was," end quote. She, of course, is referring to none other than Alexios Komnenos. And Alexios would enter history, you could say, during this quote-unquote Roussel episode she's referring to. Though Anna calls him a Celt, Roussel de Balliol, whom we've already mentioned a few times on the public podcast, was actually a rough and tumble and dastardly Norman mercenary who served under the Norman mercenary leader, Robert Crispin. Roussel, having broken from Crispin with a small band of knights of his own, served under Roger de Hauteville in Sicily in the 1060s, before learning of great opportunities out east, as rumors of Muslim hordes invading eastern Rome spread across the Mediterranean region. Roussel split from Roger's service and took his knights to Constantinople, where he was given a high command of all Norman mercenaries. In July and August of 1071, Roussel found himself leading these men out to Manzikert. Roussel and many of his knights, upwards of 1,000 by that time, survived Manzikert, but not because they valiantly stuck it out until the end and they happened to escape. Now, it turns out that the moment the emperor saw Andronicus Ducas lead the rear guard away from the battlefield, Roussel de Balliol, always the opportunist as Normans were, also saw this for what it was. He reasoned that if the Romans were willing to abandon their own emperor, then why should he stay and fight? Roussel ordered a full retreat as the rearguard dust was seen on the horizon, and he and his men, many of them who survived, collected themselves under that same fleeing Andronicus Ducas's new army, which, of course, was served directly under Caesar John Ducas. But they still had the Turkish problem after Manzikert, regardless of whatever shakeup occurred in Constantinople. And reports of Turks moving with lightning speed across the Anatolian highlands westward terrified the capital city to its core. We begin to see the first glimpses, real glimpses, of Alexios Komnenos amidst this turmoil. That is, in early 1072. It turns out that his older brother, Isaac, like Alexios, the nephew of the previous Komnene emperor, mind you, was second in charge of the army Alexios was in. This must have made their mother quite nervous, as she had just a few years earlier lost her eldest son, Manuel Komnenos, to these same Seljuk warriors. Well, actually, no, if you remember from the last episode, that's the way some of these records glorify Manuel Komnenos' death, when in fact, there was really very little glory in his death. He actually died from a pretty bad ear infection. So, yay rah for modern medicine, right? Well, Manuel's death subsequently already forbade young Alexios from going to Manzikert in the first place. His mother, Anna Delasini, she wasn't having it. She wasn't having two of her sons go off to war, much to Alexios's resentment. The man in charge of this army was the same man who fled Manzikert with the rear guard. That's, again, Andronicus Doukas. Also named a high-ranking officer for no apparent reason was Andronicus's little brother, Constantine. You can just smell the nepotism, can't you? Now, in the immediate wake of Manzikert, Roussel and his men remained in the emperor's service. Michael VII heard word of these lightning attacks, inching closer every day to his own backyard, but never mind the Seljuks for the moment. The real threat was the sudden emergence of Romanus Diogenes, risen from the grave, who was on the move toward Constantinople in a bid to reclaim his rightful crown. Michael VII immediately ordered Andronicus Doukas to take his thousands-strong remnants of the ex-emperor's army, which again included Roussel's Norman knights, numbering at least 1,000 of his own. And it was to head out to meet the emperor. We know this from the public podcast already, so we can hurdle these details, but suffice it to say that John Doukas joined the army after Romanos had been taken prisoner, and, well, the gruesome details will be spared here. The Seljuks were still on the move out east, however. If you lived outside of stone walls, you were in serious danger from their raiding and pillaging, and by late 1072 they had reached as far as Caesarea in central Anatolia. However, trouble arose out west when a warlord named Constantine Bodin rose up amongst the angry Bulgarians and declared Bulgaria's full secession from eastern Rome. Michael VII sent one of his top generals, a young man named Nicephorus Bryennius, to handle the situation. What this did was limit the force that Michael VII could respond with out east against the Turks, robbing Peter to pay Paul, as it seems. The Bulgarian uprising of 1072, which was no small occurrence, it was put down by Nicephorus Bryennius, but not without considerable effort and manpower, and some fancy scheming by Bryennius, who made quite the name for himself across the empire in that moment. This uprising ultimately accomplished nothing for the Bulgarians, and as for Eastern Rome, it proved to be just one more major drain on the military at a time when they needed as many people as possible in Anatolia. But again, how about that Bryennius fella, huh? Michael VII decided to keep Andronicus Doukas close to him for protection's sake, so he ordered Isaac Komnenos to lead the Byzantine army southeast to deal with the Seljuks, to try to not only win back its territory, but also to win back some of that good old Roman pride. By his side this time was his little brother Alexios. Anna Komnenos, Alexios' daughter, again, writes that Alexios had just sprouted what the Byzantine called his quote-unquote first beard, which would make him around 20 years old at the time. Much to their mother's resentment, her two sons now headed south together to face the mighty Turks. When the Byzantine forces reached Caesarea, the Turks had already moved on, but Isaac Komnenos decided to stop, regroup, and reevaluate the situation. Anna Komnenos writes, quote, "Roman prestige had fallen, the ground was giving way, as it were, beneath their feet." End quote. Something occurred that struck the Byzantine army a devastating blow, though at the time there was no way anyone could tell just how devastating it would be. For some reason, we don't know why, but for some reason, General Isaac Komnenos punished a Norman mercenary who was under the leadership of Roussel de Balliol. And in the middle of the night, Roussel led his men away from Caesarea. The Byzantines just lost about 1,000 Norman knights at a time when they could least afford to lose even 1/10 of that. The next day, Isaac ordered his brother Alexios to take a large contingent of men to hunt down the deserting party. But during the preparation of the expedition, a report came in that a large Seljuk force was approaching Caesarea. Isaac couldn't afford to spare not only the men, but his second in command. They buckled down and prepared for a fight. The Seljuks came in like a fierce storm and took the Komnenos boys by surprise. Isaac Komnenos was taken prisoner and Alexios escaped by the skin of his teeth. It was another blow to Roman morale. Gathering his forces more or less on the run, Alexios, still again like 20 years old, found himself the senior commander of the survivors. He also found himself without quarter, as no one in the area would give them shelter or aid, fearing Seljuk backlash. Alexios was in a very precarious position, swinging around the southern hills of Anatolia, trying to get to either a safe coastline, which the Byzantines still controlled, or even all the way back to Constantinople. However, he was able to make contact with the Seljuk forces under Alp Arslan, as this was right before Alp Arslan's assassination. Alexios negotiated a ransom for his older brother, and Isaac was returned. He was injured from the battle and brutalized from the imprisonment, but Isaac would make a full recovery pretty quickly. A side note, within months, the Byzantine Duke of Antioch to the south of Anatolia died. So Michael VII appointed the very capable Isaac Komnenos to the increasingly pivotal city of Antioch to help keep the Seljuks at bay there. There was massive unrest within the walls of Antioch at the time, but Isaac was able to quell much of it. News came at the time, within days of the disastrous battle with the Turks, that Roussel de Balliol had been raiding northern villages. But he didn't stop there. He actually defeated a small band of Turks before storming into the Byzantine city of Ankara, the modern capital of Turkey, and declaring himself a prince of a new Norman polity in north-central Anatolia. In 1074, so we're going to jump ahead a bit, Michael VII chose Caesar John Ducas to lead a hefty army of soldiers, largely made up of inexperienced mercenaries. As we know, the Byzantine numbers were so woefully depleted by this time, to tackle the Norman problem as it came to be known, which is an interesting choice. More on that in a bit. Marching his 12,000-strong army out of the capital, John Ducas knew he had a nice number to work with. The bulk, as I said, were inexperienced, but there were a good many veterans of Manzikert to even things out within the infantry. He also had more than 500 Frankish knights and almost 2,000 Varangians, which at the time, it's worth noting, because it will come back, the Varangian Guard began to swell at the time, with hundreds of Anglo-Saxons fleeing England, pouring into Constantinople every year looking for work. This trend of Anglo-Saxons becoming Varangian Guards wouldn't begin to slow down for another couple decades. Along with John Ducas, it should be noted, was Alexios Komnenos. Anna calls Roussel de Balliol, quote-unquote, a formidable rebel and an extremely ambitious man, end quote. She continues by giving us a little heads up about what Roussel and his army, of now 3,000 knights and infantry, were up to for the several months before he was to meet up with John Ducas's army. She says, quote, at this crisis, when the condition of the empire was so desperate, he was even more tempted to rebel openly. He plundered almost all the eastern provinces. The operations against him were entrusted to many generals, renowned for bravery, men who had vast experience in battle as army commanders. But he was clearly master of these veterans. Sometimes he attacked in person, defeating his adversaries and falling upon them like a hurricane. At other times, when he sought aid from the Turks, it became so impossible to withstand his onslaughts that he even took prisoner some of the greatest generals and routed their armies." End quote. As you can see, Roussel de Balliol was tirelessly on the move the moment he left Isaac Komnenos' service. Roussel's statelet, it should be noted, was expanding too. Though it never reached the southern coastline of the Black Sea, which is northern Anatolia, he certainly controlled huge areas of territory in north-central and northeastern Anatolia. And though it was certainly by conquest this was achieved, Roussel was also taking a page out of the Hauteville playbook as well, by offering protection against Seljuks in exchange for their loyalty. Though a terror, Roussel was playing the diplomat role and was gaining favor amongst the Anatolians. And he put his money where his mouth was in two ways. One, he protected these towns and villages from invading Turks through violence, as he promised. And two, he began negotiating peace deals of sorts with a regional Turkish warlord named Artuk. Now, for a quick clarification, records indicate this Turk's name was Artuk, but Anna Komnene calls him Tutak. For clarity's sake, even when quoting Anna's work, I'll simply call this man Artuk. Now, at the end of the day, by 1074, people were beginning to slightly warm up to this Norman ruffian. Hearing that the 12,000-strong Byzantine army was marching his way, Roussel gathered his 3,000 men and ended up meeting on the opposite side of the Sakarya River in central Anatolia, just southwest of Ankara. A bridge was all that connected the two armies, as the river was not easily crossed without one. The bridge's name was the Zambos Bridge, which lends itself to the name of the battle that's about to ensue, the Battle of Zambos Bridge. Scouting the army upon his approach, it must have been interesting to see so many Anglo-Saxons within the Roman army, all of Europe, no doubt, having heard of the feats of Duke William of Normandy way up north. But what really piqued Roussel's interest were the 500 or so Frankish knights. On the evening of May 9th, 1074, campfires began to light up the darkening landscape on either side of the river. And a few hours after the sun dipped below the horizon, as the Milky Way flowed overhead and men began to fall asleep in preparation for the day's impending battle, Roussel himself slipped across the river undetected, and he quietly and secretly engaged the French knights. Their leader, a man known to history only as Papas, spoke with Roussel and heard the Norman out. After the chat, Roussel slipped back across the river undetected. On May 10th, Roussel had received peace terms from Caesar John Ducas, which was interesting. Had Roussel really been the target, then John Ducas may never have bothered with the offer of peace before the battle. Historians agree that John Ducas, the consummate politician, was probably thinking a couple steps ahead. Roussel de Balliol wasn't an enemy of Constantinople, at least in the long term. He was a potential tool against the Seljuks, who were still prowling the area. Sadly for the Romans, Roussel was no fool, and he wouldn't be bought. Well, not this time at least. Things were going well, and he was beginning to gain a foothold in his new Norman statelet. Why give that up? He could be the next William the Conqueror, or Robert Guiscard, or Roger of Sicily at this rate. The Roman envoy left the Norman camp in a huff, but Roussel was calmly welcoming the battle. On the morning of May 11th, 1074, the Battle of Zambos Bridge between the Normans and the Romans commenced. We don't know exactly how the Normans organized themselves, but we know how the Byzantines did. In the center was General John Ducas. On the right were the Frankish troops led by Papas. On the left was Andronicus Ducas. And in the rear guard was a man named Nicephorus Botaniates, an exceptionally experienced general in his own right, a fine soldier, and well-respected old man inside military circles. In addition, Botaniates was also the governor of Anatolia, so he held quite a bit of sway in the area already. But his reputation was a bit more than that. There is a story back in, I believe, 1046 or 1048. He was second in charge, much like Alexios was, and after a battle where the general first in charge, right? The general died. It was up to Nicephorus Botaniates, a very young man at the time, to gather everybody up, figure out what to do. Well, he hadn't had a chance to prove himself yet. So in that moment, his men gave him a horse to help steady his nerves and, get tall and let people see you as the leader that you can be. Well, Botaniates was not going to have any of that. He wanted to prove his valor, his bravery, his courage. And he cut the horse's legs off, all 4 of them, to prove that he was just like they were and that he would lead from the front. So his reputation was already pretty solid. And in this moment, he was the head of the rear guard. Again, his name, Nicephorus Botaniates. I wouldn't forget that name if I were you.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Disney Plus wants to know, are you ready? For Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, now streaming on Disney Plus.
Let's do this.
One of the best Marvel movies of all time is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Hey, you weren't listening to me.
I said Thunderbolts, The New Avengers is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Meet the New Avengers.
That's cool name.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, rated PG-13, now streaming on, you guessed it, Disney Plus.
The Romans were the aggressors here, and Roussel knew that. The bridge itself would play a key role because it showcased John Ducas's woefully poor understanding of military tactics. There was by no means amazing geography on his side of the bridge that would establish a perfectly defensible position, but neither did Roussel have that. But Roussel knew he didn't have to budge. As the morning light grew, each side rose and took their places. John Ducas ordered a full charge across the bridge, and feigning engagement, Roussel ordered some of his knights to pretend to fight for control of the bridge. But the end game here was to eventually allow the Byzantines to cross, which they did. All but Nicephorus Botaniates' rear guard crossed, actually. So it was the entire army, pretty much. John Ducas ordered an immediate attack, and once his left flank under Andronicus engaged with Roussel's right flank, John Ducas ordered his center to march forward. In that moment, the Frenchman Papas ordered his French soldiers to mirror John Ducas's center. They too marched forward. Once the center engaged Roussel's center and fierce fighting commenced, Papas ordered his Franks to turn right, literally about, 90-degree angle, turn right and surprise the Roman center. Let's just say this deceit had a devastating effect for John Ducas and his thousands of soldiers in the middle. Thousands fell in the blink of an eye, and Roussel pushed even harder forward toward the Roman general himself. John Ducas's only hope for turning the tide against such treachery was his rear guard. But Nicephorus Botaniates failed to follow orders. We don't know why, but it was eerily similar to what Andronicus Ducas, who was fully engaged across the river at the moment on the right flank. It mirrors what he had done to Romanus IV at Manzikert. In fact, Nicephorus Botaniates doubled down and retreated with upwards of half of John Ducas's army. Andronicus, seeing the center fall and the rear guard flee, Andronicus decided to flee as well. Unfortunately, the river was now at their backs, and what have we seen time and time again when a river is at the back of a fleeing army? There were some who drowned in their escape, but many knew the gig was up and either fought to their deaths or surrendered. Alexios Komnenos, it's worth mentioning, was at Zambos Bridge under the leadership of Andronicus, but Alexios was able to escape that day. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for Andronicus, who was captured by Roussel's forces. This left John Ducas in the center, still fighting. but watching his numbers dwindle lower and lower and lower. The Varangian Guard, again, upwards of 2,000, it was at least 1,500 men, fought to the very last, but ultimately John Ducas was also captured. The Anglo-Saxons would not have their revenge against the Normans this day. Now, things were moving quickly at this point. Alexios and other survivors of Zambos Bridge, under the new leadership of another of John Ducas' sons, Constantine, reassembled a small force in an attempt to free his father and brother. They pushed their way back across the bridge. However, Constantine Ducas was killed in the ensuing skirmish against Roussel's army, and Alexios rallied the survivors once again, but this time he, being the senior-most leader on the field, well, he opted to retreat, which was, let's be honest, the smartest move. Alexios and his kind of ramshackle force caught up to Nikephoros Botaniates' rearguard, currently hightailing it back to the capital. Roussel and his men were hot on their heels. In fact, Roussel went all the way to the Asian side of the Bosporus and captured the populated city of Chrysopolis as a testament to his abilities. And while he was there, sitting across the strait from Constantinople, Roussel de Balliol decided to proclaim John Ducas as emperor of all of Eastern Rome. It was a power move, but a strange one to be sure. His intentions might be a bit on the, internet troll side of things, daring Michael VII to do something about it, but I think he was really leveraging some internal strife within the hallowed imperial halls. By naming the uncle of the emperor, the uncle might actually enjoy the idea and be willing to support it. It was a gamble for sure. Nikephoros Botaniates would finally step up to the plate outside of Chrysopolis and reach out to the lesser of two immediate evils at the moment, the Seljuks. With Michael VII's blessing, Nikephoros Botaniates sent envoys to the new regional commander of the Seljuk forces in Anatolia. See, Sultan Malik Shah, who took over for Alp Arslan, it was his son, Malik Shah took over. Well, Malik Shah was called back to the Seljuk capital of Baghdad to put down some civil unrest there. And Malik Shah gave his kinsman, a man named Suleiman, control over central Anatolia in his absence. This place was henceforth called the Sultanate of Rum, as nearly all of Inner Anatolia had come to be under Muslim control up until 1074. Suleiman was open to negotiating with the Byzantines. Botaniates gave up quite a few concessions, which included the mind-numbingly stupid concession that resulted in Anatolian cities and towns filling with Seljuk warriors as Byzantine mercenaries. Yeah, General Nikephoros Botaniates allowed Turkish soldiers to guard Byzantine cities and towns across western Anatolia. That won't bite him in the butt in the future at all, will it? Of course, in exchange for this, Suleiman agreed to push Roussel out of the vicinity of the capital, which they did. Roussel fled Chrysopolis and retreated to Nicomedia, where he doubled down on the whole John Ducas as the new emperor thing. While Roussel was being badgered by the Seljuks with every step away from the capital he took, Michael VII recalled Nikephoros Botaniates to Constantinople, and in turn, he promoted Alexios Komnenos permanently as a general in the field. Anna Komnene writes, quote, "It was at this crucial moment in Roman affairs, when the barbarian was everywhere on the move, attacking with lightning speed, that the admirable Alexios was promoted commander-in-chief by the Emperor Michael. He was a worthy opponent for Roussel." End quote. He sent Alexios back out to track down the Norman brigand and bring him to justice at all costs. By this time, most of the towns and cities Alexios passed through were armed to the teeth with Seljuk mercenaries, which couldn't have set well with the young general. Now, While Alexios was organizing his army just south of the capital, the Seljuks were fulfilling their part of the bargain made with Bataniates. The Turks were dogging Roussel for hundreds of miles until Roussel finally turned and faced them in a pitched battle. Little is known about this particular battle, but there weren't overwhelming casualties to report. However, Roussel de Balliol himself was captured somehow and brought before Sultan Suleiman. Word was sent to Alexios, who hurried his preparations and began marching. In the meantime, the Seljuks received a visitor, Roussel's rather bold wife, who spoke face-to-face with Suleiman himself and offered a massive ransom for her husband to be set free. Ever the opportunists themselves, Suleiman and his Seljuk advisors agreed to these terms, and Roussel walked out of the enemy camp a free man. He met up with his army shortly after and rode to Ankara to regroup. Alexios just didn't have the time to get there to retrieve Roussel, but this wouldn't be the end of Alexios' dealings with Roussel de Balliol. Far from it. In the meantime, Michael VII decided to leverage his connection to the Kingdom of Georgia on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Michael VII was the son-in-law of the Georgian king. He asked the king of Georgia to hold the line out east, and should he capture Roussel, he would have a number of coastal ports along the edge of the Black Sea. Well, this was too good to be true for Georgia, so the Georgian army created an eastern wall of sorts to hem the Norman in. In late 1074, Alexios was out in the field trying to juggle the Seljuks and the Normans, while trying to spread the word that any word about a new emperor being declared is just false, that Michael VII Dukas was the rightful emperor and currently in control. But he knew the longer it took to control the Norman situation, the harder it would be to put the fires of rebellion out should people take hold of the idea of the new Norman-backed John Dukas. Now, by mid-75, things were really bad. John Carr, in his book, The Komnene Dynasty, writes, quote, "The Turkish advances in Asia Minor had triggered a mass exodus of Christian refugees who crowded, penniless, into Constantinople, exacerbating the economic crisis and driving up the crime rate. It was becoming too bad to last." End quote. Now, pressure from the capital, including from the emperor himself, began to stack up on young Alexios, now around 25 years old or so. Alexios decided to contact a local Turkish chieftain who had been ravaging northern villages and towns until, months earlier, word spread about this chieftain, who became allies with Roussel. With very few men and even fewer resources and money, Alexios was clamoring for any foothold in central and northern Anatolia. And here is when we start to see the classic, the legendary Alexios Komnenos come to life. He contacts this chieftain. If you remember his name, it's the one and the only Artuk. And he offered this Artuk, this man, a large sum of money and imperial friendship, saying, quote unquote, "Your sultan and my emperor are friends." Which isn't exactly the truth, but if you squint just so, you'll see the connection and the agreement already made between a Malik Shah and Michael VII. So Alexios ran with it. He continued, quote, "This barbarian," referring of course to Roussel de Balliol, "is an enemy of both. His whole plan of campaign is carefully thought out. For the moment, he is pursuing me with your help. Later, when the time is propitious, he will leave and make war on you." End quote. Alexios added that the reward for providing Roussel in chains would be, quote unquote, "more money than anyone else has received before." Now, Carr adds that, quote unquote, "as a piece of diplomacy, it was peerless." But here's the deal. Alexios promised something he didn't have. What he needed in front of him, first and foremost, was the pesky Norman. After that, he'd worry about how to get the payment. And it didn't take long for Artuk to trick Roussel and capture him. So Alexios was completely unprepared, though he'd sent message after message already for Emperor Michael VII to deliver on the promises made. But Anna writes, quote, "The emperor took no interest in the affair," end quote, which is just shocking. With the imperial purse denied him, it was up to Alexios to get creative. Scrounging up what he could, by favor and by force, he still came up woefully short. Alexios met Artuk at the town of Amasea. The Turks keeping a healthy distance so as not to spook the Greek residents the whole time, well, Alexios decided, regretfully, that the good folks of Amasea would have to foot the bill. But how could Alexios strong-arm this to happen? Amasea was already firmly under Roussel's control and protection. Why on earth would they ever sell their protector? The Byzantines had proved over and over again for a couple decades now that they were simply incapable, ineffective in protecting them from the invading Turks. They didn't necessarily like Roussel and his rough Frenchmen, but they did get the job done. The next morning, he called for the people of Amasea to a meeting, and here's another one of those awesome medieval manuscript speeches that certainly have a lot of truth to it, but were most certainly not the actual words spoken. But let's have some fun here. Anna writes that Alexios told the people of Amasea the following, quote, "You all know how this barbarian treated all the towns of Armeniacon, how many villages he has ravaged, how many people he's cruelly subjected to intolerable persecution, how much more money he has extorted from you. But now you have a chance to free yourselves from his evil deeds, if you wish. It is essential that he should not be allowed to get away. As you see, he is our prisoner, thanks entirely to the will of God and our zeal. But Artuk captured him and demands the reward from us. We are quite incapable of paying the money, being on foreign soil, and having already exhausted our capital on a long war against the barbarians. Of course, if the emperor were not so far away, and if the Turk granted some respite, I would make haste to get the money from Constantinople. As that is altogether out of the question, as you yourselves know, it falls on you to contribute the money, which the emperor will repay in full on my promise." End quote. Alexios lays bare the situation to the people of Amasea, and we're told that as Alexios' last words were spoken, the people exploded in fury. They were absolutely pissed. Why should they foot the bill? Some wanted to flat out murder Roussel on the spot, while others wanted to free him in the hopes that Roussel would take this into account when he was back to rampaging the region. Alexios Komnenos, in the thick of civil uproar against what he himself was just saying, understood the situation he was in. He was in mortal danger in that moment. Sure, the Byzantines had deeply rooted customs and honor toward their superiors, but they were no longer, to be clear, by all accounts, they were no longer in Byzantine territory. These people, they were still Roman, but they were firmly within Roussel's new statelet, and Roussel and his men, tyrants as they were at times, were the ones, unlike their Roman emperor, effectively keeping the Turks at bay. The majority of Amaseans just wanted protection, so why would they be okay with paying for the removal of that very protection? When the uproar occurred before his very eyes, Alexios knew he had two options. One, stay and try to convert the people to his logic, and two, get the hell out of Dodge. In true form, Alexios shied away from no challenge. Alexios stayed. Anna records another great speech here. Quote, "Men of Amasea, I'm amazed that you have so completely misunderstood the intrigues of these men who deceive you, buying their own safety at the cost of your blood and continually plotting your absolute ruin. What will you get out of Roussel's revolt? Massacres, blindings, and mutilations? Yet the men who engineer such things for you by courting the favor of the barbarian made sure that their own welfare would not be affected. At the same time, they were enjoying a glut of gifts from the emperor and humored him with assurances that they had neither surrendered you nor the town of Amasea to the barbarians. So far, They have never given a thought to you." End quote. Ah, yes, a little gaslighting sprinkled on a giant dollop of populism. Alexios knew how to fire people up, as we'll soon see more. But I maintain that there is a point to be made here, to his credit. He was doubling down and laying down the facts plain as day what was at play here. Anna continues, quote, "The reason why they want to help Roussel in his revolt, flattering him with high hopes, is that they may keep their own fortunes intact and continue to beg for honors and gifts from the emperor. If their luck should somehow alter, they will withdraw from the business and stir up the emperor's anger against you. Take my advice. Tell the troublemakers to go to blazes. Now go home, every one of you, and consider what I have said. You will know whose advice is most appropriate for you." End quote. Remarkably, when the people of Amasea heard it laid out wrapped up neatly in an us versus them package, the people of Amasea heeded Alexios's advice and they dispersed. Thinking about it, that would have to mean that there were more people who wanted Roussel dead or in prison forever than those who wanted to release the Norman warrior. And it was the latter of these two groups that Alexios was condemning. But disperse they did. However, Anna tells us that Alexios was keenly aware of how quickly men's minds can change with just a little influence. I mean, what had he just finished doing? He was well aware that anything could happen in the dead of the night. To Roussel, to him. At the moment, the people of Amasea were angry and volatile, and as the Roman army slept, they were terribly vulnerable. Alexios knew that there needed to be some point of no return. It was inevitable, as all situations like this have a point of no return. Though in his early 20s, Alexios knew that he needed to control what that point of no return would be and when it would occur. That evening, the young general devised a plan, and it had to be enacted as swiftly before nightfall, as word of mouth was key. He gathered a smattering of Amaseans as witness. Anna writes, quote, "The man," meaning Roussel, "was laid flat on the ground. The executioner brought the branding iron near to his face, and Roussel howled and he groaned. He was like a roaring lion. To all appearances, he was being blinded. But in fact, the apparent victim had been ordered to shout and bawl. The executioner, who seemed to be gouging out his eyes, was told to glare horribly at the prostrate Roussel and act like a raving madman. In other words, to simulate the punishment. So he was blinded, but not in reality. And the people clapped their hands and noisily spread the news all over town that Roussel had lost his eyes." End quote. Now, the Amaseans, as we've heard, were split on what to do. The vast majority were simply angry that they were the ones who had to foot the bill for the emperor's dealings. However, even amongst the seemingly homogeneous group of angry taxpayers, there was a serious split when it came to what to do with Roussel. Some wanted to see him in chains, others wanted to see him dead. Both of these groups no doubt longed for the days before the Turks when the Romans could actually protect them. But the other larger group knew that ship had sailed, that the Romans were an inadequate force, and that Roussel looked to be the only solution to their problems with the Turks. But, knowing this, Alexios dumped all of these subgroups into the realization that blind men could do no harm or no good. Roussel, for as far as the Amaseans knew, was now blind. Therefore, what good could the man do? And at this point, with word spread about Roussel's apparent blinding, the people immediately got to work gathering the necessary funds. What else could they do? They could hate Alexios all they wanted, but that wouldn't keep the Turks from coming if the reward wasn't paid in full. The funds were gathered, the ruse worked, Artuk was paid, and the Turks left the area indefinitely. All seemed well and back to normal. Well, normal as far as post-Manzikert Roman Empire could be. He gathered his forces, Roussel blinded and in chains too, and Alexios led his army back west toward the capital to deliver his prize to Michael VII. But he stopped in an ancestral town for the Komnenos family and met one of his cousins who was named Doukianos, who was a local leader respected and obeyed by folks as far as Constantinople. They met and no doubt shook hands as old kinsmen do, happy to see one another. And then Doukianos saw Roussel in chains being dragged along with the army, bandages wrapped around his head, looking to be in a miserable state. Doukianos, a proud and honorable man, disapproved of this treatment immensely. Say what we want 1,000 years later about the likes of Roussel de Balliol, even then, game respected game. And the Romans knew Roussel was a valiant warrior who had served the emperor dutifully for years before he defected, remember, due to the mistreatment by Alexios' older brother, Isaac, to one of Roussel's men. Anna writes, quote, "He sighed deeply," this is Doukianos, "he sighed deeply, shed tears, and accused my father of cruelty. He even went so far as to rebuke him personally for having deprived a man so noble and a true hero of his sight. He shouted that Roussel should have been saved from punishment altogether." End quote. Alexios merely took it on the chin, listened to it all, because he had revealed the ruse. So had he revealed the ruse right then, the whole gig would be up. The ruse could be revealed later, but at the very least, not until Roussel was safely locked up in a prison in Constantinople around heavy guards. Doukianos must have really let Alexios have it, publicly berating the general and all. Eventually, Alexios ordered Roussel into a small room inside Doukianos' estate and led Doukianos into that room with him. Alexios pulled the bandages from Roussel's head, revealing the Norman's eyes still very much in operation and present. Anna describes Roussel's eyes, quote-unquote, fiercely blazing. Doukianos was shocked, almost as if he didn't believe what his own eyes showed him. Anna writes, quote, "Again and again he put his hands on Roussel's eyes to convince himself that it was not a dream or a magic trick or some other newly invented manifestation of that sort." End quote. Doukianos was overcome with relief when he realized that his cousin Alexios wasn't some monster or some tyrant. After a short respite there with Doukianos, Alexios led his prisoner back to Constantinople and tossed the Norman into a dungeon where he would spend a number of years. Now, Alexios will be off doing various other things around the empire during this time, and we will get to those, but Alexios always found ways of sneaking down to the dungeon when he was in town. Alexios was filled with respect for the Norman, and he brought the man full meals and dined with him there in the dungeons and spoke with him at length about Norman culture. Apulia and Calabria, Sicily, and even Normandy itself were topics of conversation, and he learned about Duke William, Duke Robert Guiscard, and Count Roger of Sicily. Alexios was educated in the ways of the bellicose and ambitious Normans, that is, with his time, fighting Roussel, outmaneuvering Roussel, and talking with Roussel. It was also when Roussel was first imprisoned that Michael VII made two deals that would dictate what happens in the coming years. The first thing he did was to make a deal with the Hungarians to protect Eastern Rome's northern border, which was for centuries already constantly badgered by the Pechenegs. But there was also a newcomer who was pestering everyone up there, and they were called the Cumans, which were direct descendants of the truly ancient Roman foe named the Scythians. And the other thing Michael VII did was to enter into a marriage alliance with the dreaded Normans of southern Italy by offering his son Constantine's hand in marriage to Robert Guiscard's daughter, Helena. These two moves were immensely important in securing Eastern Rome's western frontiers. Make no mistake, freeing the empire up to tackle more pressing matters out east. And with Roussel de Balliol in prison, the Normans in a close alliance, and the Cumans and Pechenegs in the north, both occupied with Hungary, those more pressing matters will be where we start the next episode in our Book of Alexios series. Thank you for listening. Until next time.
Every minute your finance team spends wrestling with data is a minute lost. Insight Software's AI-powered insights instantly move you from complexity to clarity. Automated analysis, real-time reporting, strategic recommendations, all at your fingertips. Transform how your finance team works and watch your business grow. Stop wasting time. Start making smarter decisions. Learn more at insightsoftware.com/AI.